Welcome to Are You Local, a podcast about identity, self, and finding one's place away from home. My name is George. I'm an American-born Filipino who has been based in Singapore for 9 years. Throughout my life, I've lived in different places like California, Okinawa, and Manila. I created this podcast to help me uncover the meaning behind local. This episode was recorded in October 2020 with Alyssa Bautista and Eugene Santos, two of my university friends who are now based in New York. Thank you for joining today, Alyssa and Eugene from New York City. Good morning, or rather good evening.
Oh, well, good morning over there in Singapore and good evening from New York.
Yep, good evening and good night. It's 9:45 p.m. here.
So from the tropics to New York City, let's start with you, Eugene. How did you end up in New York City?
I was at a time in my life 6 years ago that I needed a fresh start. And 5 years ago, an opportunity to study at NYU presented itself. And I took it. And it's been a ride so far.
I would say that I ended up here by conscious decision the second time around. I really loved my first experience of living here. It's no place that I can compare with at the other cities. There's a saying that you either love or hate New York, and I ended up loving it, and that's why I'm back here.
Yeah, what Yas said is true. Here in New York, you end up either loving it or hating it. There's no gray area, and so far, I'm loving it.
New York is obviously like one of the world's, the Big Apple. Does anyone call it the Big Apple when you're there? Or?
No.
That's just something in the movies.
I think it's something in the movies. It's tourist culture. And one thing I've learned, if you do live here, you don't call it NYC or New York City. You just say the city.
Yeah, particularly Manhattan. Yeah. Here in New York, a lot of people live in different boroughs. But obviously, the center of many industries is in Manhattan. So especially, I think it came from that perspective where all these people different from different boroughs would come to the city for work, and then that's pretty much how it started.
How is the makeup of the population? Is there like a little, there's a Chinatown, there's an area that there's more Filipinos or more Vietnamese, more, is it like that, or is it really well distributed?
Well, it's not official, but in Queens, there is an area where there's a huge concentration of Filipinos, where there's Jollibee and all these Filipino eateries that are you can consider them as small businesses. And then one time I even saw someone who's actually on the street selling balut. I'm like, whoa, this felt like home. So yeah, there is an area that is, where you can see a lot of Filipino restaurants and businesses thriving. But the thing about here in New York is that I think there is no specific concentration of Filipinos huddling in one specific area, or because it's so big.
What do you think, Yes, having lived in New York?
I mean, one of the beauties living in New York is there's no question about diversity. There are tendencies for specific populations to be concentrated within certain neighborhoods. For example, Latinos, African Americans, or Blacks in the Bronx. There is a predominance of Chinese, East Asian population in Flushing, Queens. There, of course, in Chinatown, it's a self-labeled place here in downtown Manhattan, where it's called Chinatown, and around Midtown there's also Koreatown. The neighborhoods are not as distinct, I would say, as LA, where there's little Armenia, little Ethiopia, little Manila. Is there Manila town in LA or Filipino towns? I think it's Filipino town, but I've never actually been in that place. But here, I actually just found out 2 weeks ago that area that Eugene is describing in Queens, which is Jackson Heights in Queens, is actually called Little Manila. There's a strip there of Filipino carinderias, and it's actually very nice during the pandemic that they do outdoor seating, their tents. There are these, what do you call those? Those flaglets, the ones that you put on in fiestas. Banderitas. Yes, there's banderitas. There's loud karaoke. That won't go away. There is your milon, halo-halo, sago that's being served. And yeah, so, but even though there tends to be, concentrations of these subcultures within little neighborhoods, it's not too much of a distance because honestly speaking, you're talking about a little island called Manhattan and other boroughs that are surrounding it. If you do crave a specific cuisine, it's within maybe 1 or 3 miles, and that can't be more than 30, 40 minutes away. I think that's one of the beauties that I like to, embrace about New York City.
Yeah, it's a very diverse city and place, and that's what I can say.
You just described these neighborhoods, which feels like home away from home. But let's say you're in another part of the city, or rather, let's put yourself further away. Have you ever been asked that question? Do you find yourself explaining where you're from?
It's a bit of a yes and no for me. Because sometimes being Filipino is something that I volunteer when I feel comfortable with a stranger, and I don't necessarily hide it, but it becomes part of the conversation if it comes up naturally. And one common thing that I observed is that they always say, or I've had a lot of shared saying that, oh, you don't have an accent. And I'm like, yes, dude, I do. It usually comes out especially when my tongue gets twisted. But that's another thing about, let's say, mostly Filipinos in our generation onwards, I think. We usually can assimilate better.
And yes, what do you think? Have you been asked that question?
Yeah, a lot. And I guess the question comes up after an assumption of who I or where I am from. And then I correct them, no, I'm actually not that, what you're assuming. So when I do meet somebody face to face, I tend to notice that they mistake me for something that some place that's not too far from the Philippines. It's still the Southeast. I commonly get mistaken for being Thai or Vietnamese or Cambodian. I'm like, well, I love their food, but I'm actually Filipino. Yeah, I like it when people ask and are curious. But then, in this day and age where, about people are becoming extra conscious about race and everything and microaggressions, like, I don't know if that's something that can be considered a microaggression. I was hearing saying oh, you don't have an accent,
or you speak English really good.
Yeah, you speak English really good. Why am I supposed to not speak English very good?
Okay, we've spoken about how your experiences so far in New York, integrating or living there, but how about within the Filipino community itself? Are there differences between those who arrived in the United States recently or second, third generation Filipino Americans? How's the Filipino community in New York City?
I don't think there's a hierarchy or tension per se. It's more of, being able to connect with each other. It depends on if that other person, the other Filipino, also came, immigrated from the Philippines, like, me and Eugene. We were not exactly born here or grew up straight here. Unlike the other second gen or third generation Filipinos who are born and raised here. I think there's a different sense of connection when you're talking to somebody who shares the same experiences like you, who moved here when they were discovering what to do with their life, what career path am I going to go with, how do I survive here, who are the friends, who are the family that I get to call family. There's a different connection with the people that I meet, the Filipinos that I meet. And it's very common in my nature of work. I work in a hospital, and it's undeniable that the majority of the nurse workforce is Filipino, and they easily, quote unquote, adopt you if they find out you're Filipino. And once you speak to them in Tagalog, they easily warm up to you. And taga saan ka sa atin? Like, where are you from? From our place. And then, there comes oh, me too. Or really, that's where I came from too. I can't believe we came from the same hometown. What a small world. But even if you came from a different place in the Philippines, it's still considered a small world if you all meet here in New York City.
I agree with yes, because that's also one thing about being a Filipino in New York is, regardless if you were born and raised in the Philippines or you're just Filipino by blood, the fact that you're Filipino always brings up feelings of warmth, or like what Yas said, especially if someone grew up in the Philippines, they would adopt you or would be warmer to you. They would ask where you came from. They would ask, what did you do? And everything like that. So, yeah, definitely I can say that's pretty much one of the things that I realized living here is that the Filipino connection tends to be warmer than what I thought it would be. Because in the Philippines, of course, you're surrounded by Filipinos. And I have to admit, mostly all look the same, and there it's not really that diverse, I guess. So when I came here, where it's sort of a different world, you see all these people from different races. The fact that you're Filipino, and when someone finds out that you're Filipino, it usually brings up a really warm feelings like, oh, hello, we came from the same country. It feels like home. So that's the feeling I get. It's fuzzy in a way.
We described New York as a diverse city, like anywhere in the world, not just New York, not just the United States, anywhere in the world. It's not going to be equal for everybody. Do you see these inequalities in front of you happening?
I think one glaring inequality in New York City is the cost of living. So depending on where you live here, that's probably going to be one of the disparities. Can you afford to live in New York City? There are a lot of options anyway in New York City. There are different neighborhoods that have higher cost of living. I mean, higher rent prices versus other neighborhoods that have lower rent prices. You don't necessarily have to live in Manhattan itself. You can live outside of the city. A lot of people commute to the city and commute back to their home, which is outside of the city, from upstate, from Connecticut, from New York, from New Jersey, from Long Island. So I think that's the biggest factor. Rent is sky high, and maybe during the pandemic now it's a better time to look at rent prices, but we know that this is not something permanent.
In terms of inequality, personally, I never felt it in a sense that it was totally offensive or blatant to me, but it's really more of the question of the cost of living here, rent, food. Of course, before the pandemic happened, there's always going to be nights where you have to go out or meet up with some friends. So it's really about the financial side of it. And also because from what I can say, this city or New York City itself has a way of testing your limits and your patience in many ways. So I guess it's true what pop culture says, that if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere.
When I look at New York, it's the romanticized New York, the one that you see in the TV shows, in the movies, what you hear about, what you see on social media. And of course, I was quite curious to knowing that there are movements like Black Lives Matter. I mean, these racial inequalities, like if you see these, in other parts of the United States, I always feel like maybe you won't really see that in New York. But I mean,
oh yeah, you can definitely see it here.
Everywhere.
Definitely, I've seen marches for the Black Lives Matter movement. So definitely, it does happen here in this city.
You do see in media that there are protests here in New York City about Black Lives Matter in the same way that there are protests in any other state too. But that also that doesn't necessarily mean that the racism just exists here. It's just that people are vocal and they are in an environment, they feel comfortable expressing their rights or fighting for their rights here in a climate that's probably felt as receptive or safe to voice those out.
Because it's such a big city that you can just like go around with your routine, and if you don't happen to be in those areas or you're not exactly a participant, then it doesn't feel unsafe. You know how like New Yorkers have a stereotype of being rude, quote unquote. They're not exactly rude from what I found out. It's just that they don't have time to sugarcoat things, that they would just rather say things directly to you. But they're one of the nicest people when you actually need help or ask directions.
Exactly. Yeah, I also I also disagree with that stereotype that quote unquote real New Yorkers are rude. It's they're genuine. They they'll tell you what you want to hear, and well, they won't tell you what you want to hear. They'll tell you what you need to hear. Um, when you walk into a bagel place, for example, they're not gonna like greet you, "Hi, good morning. How may I help you?" They're gonna be like, "Okay, what do you want?" Like you just tell them, "I want a toasted bagel with a schmear of cream cheese," and that's it. There's no like small talk, pleasant talk, or whatever like that.
Is
So
that compared to, let's say, California, San Diego, San Francisco? I mean, is there a West Coast, East Coast? There's a difference in.
I would say New York and non-New York, and that's just how New York is. That's just how New York is. Yeah, you walk into a bodega, you say what you want, but at the same time, they're not gonna, bother you with anything else like nonsense. So it's just no nonsense culture here.
Both of you, what is your one favorite thing that you think represents New York the most?
It's hard to pinpoint it to one thing. That's the issue there.
I want to point out to people listening that when I asked that question and I could see both of them on video, both of them had this nice smile.
Because it's hard to really pinpoint it to one specific thing.
Let's say I'm going to New York for the first time. Where would you bring me first? What's the first thing I should see?
For one single object or icon that is my favorite for New York, I like the skyscrapers a lot. I even though I've been living here for a while, you look in my picture roll on my phone pictures. I would have a lot of pictures of the World Trade Center still, or the Chrysler Building, as if I'm seeing it for the first time, or the Empire State. I'm just always in awe. But then you look down, there's garbage everywhere. It's like a Quiapo. Like, when I first came here, I'm like, is this really New York? I didn't imagine it would be this dirty and filthy, and rats. Oh my God, they're real. They're bigger than cats. But, but look up, and the skyscrapers are there. It's nice. It's a nice view. And yeah, you just get the best of both worlds.
There's always that unexplainable feeling that because you live here, it feels like a badge of honor, even if you feel that, sometimes the city wears you down. But there are days when it feels like I am here. I am here. And it feels like an achievement on its own.
If you lived there in that city long enough, do you consider yourself local? How do you identify? Filipino American, a New Yorker, visitor?
Well, technically, I'm not yet a New Yorker because they have this 10-year rule unofficially, at least culture-wise. But yeah, I do feel like a local at this point. Because one, New York doesn't feel as romanticized as it used to be. So I'm guessing that's one of the feelings that come with being a local. But at the same time, there's also a mix of pride and achievement that you live here. And it feels nice to be in the city at the same time. So I can definitely say that I feel like a local here. And it's a small thing, but I actually feel validated when someone asks me for directions randomly, because I think that gives off the vibe that, oh, they think that I live here. So they ask me questions randomly or for directions. So that's just a little thing that I have in mind.
I love that. Yes, how about you?
Yeah, I read that somewhere too. Strangely, I thought that was just a random thing. Like, who makes random numbers such as 10 years? Who makes that rule? But I know I read that somewhere. So I think that's the unofficial or official way of saying if you're a local here in New York.
Lived there for 10 years?
Living here for 10 years, yeah. So I mean, but time limits aside, I still feel like I am in the transition somewhere in between tourist and local. I'm in that gray area, in that limbo where I am beyond a tourist, but I don't think I know the little nuances still about being a New Yorker for 10 years. The restaurants that are good, that even though it doesn't show like a good review on Yelp or Foursquare, that it's actually good. That's actually where the locals go. So go there. So I feel like I have a little bit of that knowledge where to go, where not to go?
I think being here, it's always a lifelong journey. You always get to discover new things, and even if you feel that the city wears you down from time to time, it always finds a way to invigorate your senses and make you feel proud that you are in this city. So that I can say, it always finds a way to surprise you or make you feel that you are lucky that you're here.
I feel like it also has something to do with being a Filipino in New York, not just being a local in New York, but being a Filipino in New York. I always feel like living here, coming from a different country, I consider myself a third culture kid still. And I always have that feeling that I'm an outsider looking in. And I maybe that's part of the reason I don't consider my local yet a local yet. I don't consider myself a local yet. And I don't know if someday I will ever get to that part, because somewhere in me, I still feel like there is this sense that I came here for something. I'm trying to achieve something. And when is that end point? I don't know. So only time will tell. So, but being a third culture kid here gives me this new set of eyes that, you just have this bigger perspective of where you're living, that, I used to just, maybe this wasn't even part of my dream, or maybe it was part of my dream, and now I'm here. And it's, as what Eugene said, it's a good feeling to think about it. Sometimes you forget about it. You get lost in the daily grind, and you forget that you're actually living in a place that people dream of vacationing in. So it's a good feeling, but it's still, I feel like sometimes you're an outsider looking in still.
If I may add, it feels like actually there was this one time when during the early periods of the pandemic, when I actually rode the subway, and there was this ad saying New Yorkers are tough, or something to that message. When I saw it, for some reason, there was just something in my heart that felt, oh, I actually felt proud to be part of that story, that eventually New York will find its way to rise above this. Of course, only time can tell, but the city has seen a lot of things happen to it, and it's always like risen above it. So just to be part of that narrative, even in like some small way, always feels like an accomplishment for me, regardless of where life takes me.
Beautifully said, Eugene. And yes, thank you so much for joining today's podcast episode. Still, there's so many things I want to know about New York. I'm excited about it. I wish, in a world without pandemic, I was planning to take a career break, actually. We've been working since graduating 14 years ago.
Yeah, you can do it.
George, it's totally doable.
Yeah, definitely. You can do it.
Thanks, Yas and Eugene, so much for joining today's podcast. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.